Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. Of all the many, many monsters and fabulous beasts of legend, perhaps none are as popular, recognizable, and iconic as the dragon. Dragons are found within the mythology and folklore of every single culture on the planet, and dominate within the fantasy genre of storytelling in the modern age. They may be seen as ravenous and greedy fiends, downright evil creatures that lay waste to all that they see before them. But they may also be seen as benevolent gods, protectors of humanity and the natural and spiritual worlds. And sometimes, they are little more than animals, existing at the top of the food chain and dominating an environment. This program will showcase a select handful of the legendary dragons of mythology and folklore. Our first dragon comes from Japanese mythology, Ryujin, the god of the sea and the bringer of rain and thunder. As with other Japanese dragons, or Ryu, Ryujin has a long serpentine body, antler-like horns, scales like a koi fish, clawed hands and feet with 3 toes, and long tendrils that resemble facial hair. Legend says that Ryujin lived on the bottom of the ocean in a jewel-encrusted palace made of red and white coral, where each day spent there was 100 years in the human world. Fish, sea turtles, and jellyfish acted as his loyal servants, and from his deep-sea home, he controlled the ebb and flow of the tides, with a magical set of jewels. Like many other sea gods throughout various mythologies, Ryujin was as temperamental as the deep waters, calm and generous one moment, wrathful and deadly the next. Nevertheless, Ryujin appears in numerous tales of Japanese mythology, both aiding and hindering humans who encounter him, and he was revered as the ancestor of all of Japan's emperors. In Chinese mythology, the dragon was called the Long, which had long symbolized imperial authority, and acts as the template for most other dragons found in various other East Asian cultures. The Long was depicted with a camel-like head adorned with stag-like horns, 4 legs, each with a 5-digit claw, and a long serpentine body covered in 117 carp-like scales, ending in a feathery tail. As with many dragons of Eastern traditions, the Chinese Long would often act more in a benevolent light than anything else, though it was still more than capable of dealing out righteous fury should they ever feel insulted. They were heavily associated with water, capable of bringing rain to agricultural settlements or purifying water sources. But they were also capable of creating violent storms, floods, and tidal waves. Dragons feature in many, many tales of Chinese mythology, from the thunder god Shenlong to the volcano dragon Fuzanglong, to the dragon who went on to be featured in the Chinese zodiac. But while dragons of the East were portrayed as benevolent and generous, most dragons of the West were destructive and violent, a stark contrast to their Asian cousins. Among the most iconic was the Wyvern of medieval Europe, a fire-breathing monstrosity with an appetite to match. The Wyvern had a distinctly reptilian appearance, sporting a massive set of bat-like wings, 2 powerful legs, and a whip-like tail ending in an arrowhead point. Among the most famous wyvern tales was the Dragon of Morteford, where a baby wyvern was secretly raised by a young girl named Maud, who fed it milk and played with it in the forest. As the wyvern grew, it developed a taste for meat and began attacking forest creatures, local livestock, and then eventually, people. For years, the wyvern terrorized the area, attacking anyone that came near it, save for Maud, its only friend. But even Maud could not stop the wyvern's violent nature, and the dragon continued its rampage until it was stopped by a knight named Garstone. With its unique and easily recognizable appearance, the wyvern is among the most popular dragons ever imagined, appearing in countless myths and legends, upon coat of arms, and in many fantasy stories of both print and film alike. Dragons were always dangerous, whether they be benevolent or malevolent in nature, but arguably, none were as deadly as the cockatrice. Appearing in medieval bestiaries and stories, the cockatrice was a bizarre creature resembling a small wyvern, but with the head of a rooster. What it lacks in size, it made up for in devastating power. Its breath was toxic, killing anything that it breathed on like a corrosive acid. When it would drink from a water source, the water would be forever poisoned. And what is worse is its gaze, said to kill anyone who would make eye contact with it, not unlike the basilisk or the Catoblepas from Roman mythology. As dangerous as the cockatrice was, it was not without its share of weaknesses. It was said that one may combat the cockatrice with the use of a mirror, turning its own power against it. Additionally, the cockatrice's power had no effect on weasels, which were said to be used to kill the creature, and the wretched beast would die instantly upon hearing the sound of a rooster crowing. One of the largest dragons ever imagined was Jormungand of Norse mythology, one of several of Loki's beastly offspring. Also known as the Midgard Serpent, or the World Serpent, Jormungand was large enough to wrap itself around the whole of Midgard, and put the end of its tail in its mouth, or even crush it in its coils. Jormungand was the archenemy of the thunder god Thor, with whom the serpent would have a number of close encounters and quick skirmishes. Among the most famous occasions, Thor went on a fishing trip with a giant named Hymir. After the pair rowed far out to sea, and they could no longer see the shore, Thor hurled a massive fishhook into the waters, baited with an ox's head. In no time at all, Jormungand was caught on the line and pulled from the depths. As Thor was about to deal the serpent a deadly blow, the frightened Hymir cut the line out of panic. Thor was enraged as Jormungand escaped back into the sea, their final duel to take place at the end of days in the Battle of Ragnarok, a fight that would ultimately claim the lives of both god and monster. Faun mythology from Benin tells of Edohuedo, a gigantic rainbow-colored dragon who carries the entirety of the earth in his coils. Similar in appearance to the rainbow serpents of Aboriginal Australian mythology, Edohuedo was the most loyal servant of the supreme god Nanabaluku, carrying him in his mouth as he traversed between the spirit and mortal worlds. It was said that the very earth was created by Nanabaluku with the aid of the Great Serpent, whose winding and writhing movements sculpted the land, creating hills and valleys and rivers. When the earth was completed, Edo coiled himself beneath in order to keep it steady, and his master created the seas in order to house and cool the mighty dragon. It is said that to this very day, Edo lives beneath the sea, holding the earth in his coils and his tail in his mouth. When the serpent shifts and adjusts, the earth trembles and quakes. A pair of monkeys live beneath the sea with him, and feed him iron bars every day. But it is said that one day, the monkeys will run out of iron, and Edo will abandon his post and let the earth fall. Greek mythology has more than a few dragons within its tales of heroes and monsters, and one of the most vicious was called Ladon. Born of the union of Typhon and Echidna, Ladon was immense in size, sometimes described as having up to 100 heads, each one filled with venom and uncontrollable rage. Ladon acted as the guardian of the Garden of the Hesperides, namely the sacred apples that grew there. Like many of its siblings, Ladon was killed after a battle with Hercules, who struck him with an envenomed arrow, and would go on to claim the golden apples with aid from the Titan Atlas. From English legend comes the story of the monstrous lambton worm. As the story goes, this dragon began as a small eel-like creature that had got caught by the young ne'er-do-well John Lambton. Disgusted by his catch, Lambton threw the wretched creature down a well, but the worm did not die. Instead, it grew to an immense size and bore the appearance of a wingless serpentine dragon. While Lambton was away fighting in the Crusades, the dragon had escaped from the well and went on about satiating its appetite on whatever it could find. Livestock, fish, and game surrounding the area began to gradually and steadily dissipate, falling victim to the dragon's appetite. Any villager or traveler who encountered the beast would likewise meet the same grisly fate. In an effort to subvert the potential attacks on people and livestock, the village began to leave a daily offering to the worm, but no amount was ever enough for the beast. The worm grew larger and larger, devouring people and animals, destroying farms and houses, uprooting trees and more. Those who attempted to face the creature learned that it had the ability to heal rapidly and reattach body parts that had been lopped off by the stroke of a sword or an axe. The worm seemed unkillable, and the land would be doomed. That is, until the return of John Lambton, who faced the monster in a suit of armor coated in sharp blades and spikes. Bringing the fight to the middle of a strong river, John hacked and slashed at the monster, and its body parts drifted far down the river as they were hacked away. The Lambton worm's greatest asset was now nullified, and in a last-ditch effort to save itself, the dragon constricted itself around the knight, gripping him tightly in its coils. But alas, the spearheads and razor blades of John's armor pierced deep into the wretch's hide, killing it all the faster. The Lambton worm died within moments. The light left its eyes, and the dragon's corpse floated downriver in pieces. Dragons and dragon-like creatures are also found across the Atlantic Ocean, and in the stories of Native American peoples, such as the Piasaw of Illini mythology. Painted upon the cliffs above the Mississippi River in Alton, Illinois, the Piasa is depicted as having a large scaly body, bat-like wings spanning 50 feet wide, talons like a bird of prey, a long fish-like tail, sharp antlers, a man-like face, and an appetite for human flesh. According to an account by John Russell of Shirley College, the Piasa continuously wrought devastation to the indigenous people of the area, until it came face to face with Chief Watoga. As the story goes, Watoga acted as bait for the monster, luring it into an enclosed area surrounded by brush. When the dragon was mere feet away from the chief, he signaled an attack, and a clutch of hidden warriors sprang out and rained poison-tipped arrows down upon the Piasa until it at last lay dead. Though Russell's account is hotly debated whether or not it was a true legend of the Alini people, or just a fantasy crafted by Russell, this story directly echoes the myths of dragons and dragon slayers of Europe, and the Piasa itself remains an example of an American dragon. Our final dragon comes from the Epic of Beowulf, long debated by scholars to be the first, or at least most influential, depiction of a classic European dragon. Beowulf's dragon was massive and ancient, a gigantic reptilian beast with 4 limbs, bat-like wings, a tail that could demolish enemies with lightning-fast strikes, scorching fire breath as if from the pits of hell itself, and a penchant for treasure. In the story, an escaped slave took refuge in a cavern, soon discovering that the cave belonged to a dragon. The dragon was sound asleep atop a massive pile of treasure, no danger to anyone. That is, if the intruder was wise enough to leave before the dragon awoke. But the slave was tempted by the gold, despite his fear of the monster, and he reached out and snatched a golden cup from the vast hoard, and he quickly scampered away. When the dragon awoke, it instantly noticed a piece of his treasure had been taken, and it was filled with reptilian fury, and he unleashed fiery wrath down upon the kingdom of Beowulf. Though the king had grown old, he was ever the warrior, and sought to face the dragon in single combat and save his kingdom. But the might of the dragon was too great, shattering Beowulf's sword and dousing him with his fire breath. With the aid of his companion Wiglaf, Beowulf at last managed to slay the savage dragon before he succumbed to his injuries. Arguably no creature of legend was ever as famous, revered, and feared as the dragon, appearing in a vast array of cultures all across the world. Though they may bear similarities and a handful of unifying traits, no two dragons are exactly alike in either appearance or behavior. From savage monsters such as the Wyvern or Ladon, to wise and helpful beings such as the Lung or Edo, to bizarre anomalies such as the Cockatrice or the Piasa. These few are but a handful of examples of a creature that has flown its way into the myths, stories, and imaginations of countless people throughout time. It could be argued that no other mythical creature has ever or will ever have the lasting impact of the mighty dragon. In the days following Susanoo's expulsion from Takamagahara, the storm god found himself wandering the countryside. He traveled about the Izumo province until he found himself at the head of the high river, where within he noticed a pair of chopsticks floating down the stream. Susanoo surmised that there must be some people nearby, and proceeded to follow the river in search of them. As he neared the people he sought, Susanoo could hear the sound of crying, the kind of sobbing that can only stem from utter anguish and total suffering. Before long, he came into view of an elderly couple embracing a beautiful young woman, with tears streaming from all of their eyes. The storm god approached and wished to know the cause of their suffering. The couple introduced themselves as Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi, and they told Susanoo that their daughter, Kushinada Hime, was to be sacrificed to a dragon called Yamata no Orochi. This monster was said to span the distance of 8 valleys and 8 hills. Across his back grew a forest of firs and cypress trees, and his underside was inflamed and smeared with blood. He had not 1, but 8 vicious heads, with burning red eyes, colored as the winter cherry. And on the other end was an 8-forked tail, capable of lashing out at devastating speed. No mortal who was brave or foolish enough to confront the monster ever lived to tell the tale. The elderly couple originally had 8 daughters, but each year Yamata no Orochi came and devoured one, until only Kushinada Hime was left. The couple lamented that there was nothing that they could do to save their only remaining daughter. Moved by the couple's story, enchanted by the young woman's beauty, and enticed by the challenge of battling such a beast, Susanoo told the family before him that he would rid the land of Yamata no Orochi, in return for Kushinada Hime's hand in marriage. Upon agreement, Susanoo began to formulate a plan of attack. Though he himself was a formidable warrior, facing a dragon, let alone one with 8 heads, and whose body spanned such a distance, would require the utmost cunning. First, Susanoo transformed his future wife into a comb and stuck it in his hair so that she would be safe from Orochi's wrath. Next, he had the couple brew a large batch of 8-fold refined sake and divide it into 8 massive vats. As the couple brewed, Susanoo hastily constructed a great fence with 8 gates, and behind each gate he placed one of the vats of sake. The earth began to rumble and shake. The smell of cypress and rancid blood hung in the air. The dragon was on his way. Susanoo and the others quickly hid, and no sooner were they settled that Yamata no Orochi came into view. While the awful creature searched for his maiden dinner, he was almost instantly tantalized by the aroma of sake. He stuck each of his heads through a separate gate and gorged himself on the strong liquor. The beast's body began to relax. His mind grew foggy, and his eyes grew heavy. It was not long before Yamata no Orochi was fast asleep, drunk on the rice wine. Susanoo saw his chance, drew his sword, and slashed away at the monster. In his drunken state, the dragon could hardly react to the lightning-fast blade of the storm god. In what seemed like moments that stretched on for what seemed like hours, Yamata no Orochi's 8 heads were severed by Susanoo's sword and rolled upon the ground. The high river began to turn red as Susanoo proceeded to hack the dragon's body into pieces. As he was cutting one of the serpent's tails, Susanoo's sword struck something hard, shattering his blade. Peering into the cut, he found a sharp sword lodged within. He pulled the great blade out of the serpent's tail, and realizing that it was no ordinary sword, he offered it up to his elder sister, Amaterasu, the sun deity and ruler of Takamagahara. This sword was called Kusanagi Tsurugi, the Great Sword Kusanagi, and became one of the 3 great imperial treasures of Japan. With Yamata no Orochi slain, and his newfound family safe, Susanoo built a great palace in Suga, where he felt his heart refreshed. Upon finishing the construction of his palace and appointing his father-in-law to oversee it, Susanoo looked up to the sky and said,
Yakumo tatsu, izumo yaigaki, tsuma gomi ni yaigaki, tsukuru so no yaigaki yo. Izumo is a land protected by clouds aplenty, and like this land of Izumo, I shall build a fence to protect the palace where my wife will live, like the clouds in this land of Izumo.
Centuries ago, on the banks of the River Wear near Durham, England, stood Lambton Castle, the heir of which was John Lambton, a lazy and self-centered youth who never did anything aside from what he wanted to do. One Sunday morning, when he was supposed to be attending service at church, he decided to go fishing instead. Several of the elders of the town chastised him. Sunday belonged to God. Nothing should take precedence. But John paid it no mind. He wanted to go fishing, and so he would go fishing. After a few hours sitting upon the riverbank and having abysmal luck, John's line suddenly went taut. Something was pulling on the hook. Something very strong. Thinking it may be a sizable fish, John pulled and pulled with all his might, until at last he brought his catch up to the surface. But when John examined his catch, it was not a fish at all. It was a bizarre, eel-looking creature, like a giant worm that was beginning to sprout legs. Seeing this abomination, John threw the creature into a nearby well, believing himself to be rid of the wretched creature. As time would go on, John left his home to fight the Crusades in a foreign land. Though John was gone for the time being, the worm he had caught from the river and thrown into the well was still very much alive. And as time passed, it grew and grew in size, and looked more and more monstrous. 2 years after John's departure, the worm in the well grew to an immense size, and bore the appearance of a wingless serpentine dragon. It had escaped from the well, and went about satiating its appetite on whatever it could find. Livestock, fish, and game surrounding the area began to gradually, steadily dissipate, falling victim to the dragon's appetite. Any villager or traveler who encountered the beast would likewise meet the same grisly fate. In an effort to subvert the potential attacks on people and livestock, the village began to leave a daily offering to the worm. At first they offered a trough filled with 20 gallons of milk. When that was not enough, they tethered 2 sheep to a far-off tree as an offering. The worm grew larger and larger, and the people grew poorer and poorer. When they had run out of sheep, the monster acted more and more dangerous, devouring people and animals, destroying farms and houses, uprooting trees and more. Those who attempted to face the creature learned that it had the ability to heal rapidly and reattach body parts that had been lopped off by the stroke of a sword or an axe. The worm seemed unkillable, and the land seemed doomed. After 7 years abroad, the prodigal son of Lambton Castle, now dubbed Sir John Lambton, returned to his home. But upon returning, he saw his once flourishing town near desolate. Birds no longer sung, the herds were thinned, the farms neglected, buildings crushed, and no people strayed outside. John inquired his father as to what had happened, and when he had learned of the atrocities of the dragon, he came to the brutal realization that this monster was the same ugly, pitiful worm he had cast into the well all those years ago. Though he had been gone for so long, and the ravages of war had changed him as a man, John knew all too well his selfishness and his carelessness caused this mess. The blood of all those who lost their lives to the dragon were on his hands. The Lambton worm was his fault. Sir John knew what he had to do. He had to slay this dragon, rid the land of this curse so that maybe it could rise again from the ashes. Though he was a skilled swordsman and a brave soldier, he knew he could not just rush headlong into battle against the worm. He needed the advice of an expert in the supernatural. So he sought the counsel of a witch in the woods. The witch told him of the worm's strength, ferocity, and most importantly, of its unsettling ability to reattach its body parts when they had been hacked off. She gave him a sound strategy to combat the worm, but she warned him that the Lambton worm is a curse upon his house. The only way to break the curse was to kill the first living thing he saw after he slew the dragon. John told his father that he would signal his victory over the monster by sounding his hunting horn 3 times. Upon hearing this, his father was to send his hunting dogs to his location. Sir John was careful to follow the witch's advice. He covered his armor in sharp spikes, spearheads, and razor blades, and he waded into the middle of the River Weir. Smelling a potential meal wandering into his territory, the Lambton worm slid into the river and rushed after the man who had thrown it into a well a lifetime ago. The 2 combatants engaged one another, and John hacked and slashed with deadly skill. The dragon previously had no fear of swords or men who wielded them, but as its body parts were hacked away, they were carried off by the river's current, unable to be reattached. The Lambton worm's greatest asset was now nullified. In a last-ditch effort to save itself, the Lambton worm constricted itself around the knight, gripping him in his coils. But alas, the spearheads and razor blades of John's armor pierced deep into the wretch's hide, killing it all the faster. Bleeding from countless wounds, The lambton worm died within moments. The light left its eyes, and the dragon's corpse floated downriver in pieces. The village was finally safe from its wrath and gluttony. John Lambton's shame finally ended. But Lambton's suffering was not yet over. When he blew his horn to summon his father's dogs, instead it was his father who had arrived, relieved beyond words that his son was alive, and the worm was dead. Though the witch had instructed him to kill the next living thing he saw after killing the worm, lest his family be cursed, he could not bear to kill his own father. And so what the witch had foretold came to pass, and for 9 generations following the death of the worm, no lord of Lambton would die peacefully in his bed. Every culture on Earth has a dragon lurking somewhere in its mythology. The dragons of Asia tend to be beings of immense power, connected to nature and the very cosmos. The ancient peoples of the Philippines had their own gigantic serpent of mythical power, one capable of causing earthquakes and eclipses, and large enough to swallow the moon as easily as a snake swallows a mouse. Bakunawa. Across the islands of the Philippines, there are a number of differing stories about Bakunawa. And yet, there are a number of similar recurring traits about the creature and its story. In all versions, Bakunawa is a massive dragon, one of the largest in all mythology, often bearing serpentine qualities. And in all stories, Bakunawa manages to swallow one or more moons right out of the sky, leading him into conflict with both mankind and the gods. In Cebuano lore, the supreme god Bathala set in the sky 7 moons to illuminate the nighttime world, and to stay off the darkness a bit longer. Gazing up from his lair in the ocean, Bakunawa was enchanted by the beautiful light of the moons, and sought them for himself. Bakunawa rose from the depths and flew into the sky, and began to devour the moons as he came upon them. As the night sky grew darker, the people of Earth were terrified, and called upon Bathala for aid in the matter. Bathala bade the people of Earth to make a great ruckus to frighten away the covetous dragon. So just as Bakunawa prepared to devour the final moon, the people began to bang on pots and pans, stamp their feet on the floor, play on drums and percussion instruments, and shout at the top of their lungs. The great noise filled the dragon's ears, and was stricken with confusion, which quickly turned to panic. Bakunawa retreated back into the sea, and Bathala planted bamboo on the surface of the moon, seen today as the spots on the moon's surface. And whenever the great serpent again tried to swallow the moon, signaled by an eclipse, the people of Earth would remember to raise a ruckus to scare off Bakunawa. In other tellings, Bakunawa's theft of the moons centered around his sister, a being in the form of a large sea turtle, who would visit a certain island in order to lay her eggs. When the people discovered the location of the island, the sea turtle soon died, never to return, infuriating Bakunawa and driving him to rebel against the people and the gods for driving his sister to death. Bakunawa took his revenge by taking the moons from the sky. The moon deities found out about the loss of their siblings to the jaws of Bakunawa and began to fight back. But the dragon's might was not to be underestimated. In the end, Bakunawa was defeated by the combined efforts of Bathala, Siddhapa, Libulan, and the people of Earth who banged their pots and instruments once more. These are but a selection of the stories surrounding the mighty being that is Bakunawa. Coming from stories of oral tradition passed down from generation to generation, and only within the last century or so having been made available through printed words, Bakunawa's legend changes from region to region and story to story. But in all depictions, Bakunawa is honored and feared as the powerful force of nature that he is. Whenever a lunar eclipse took place, or the earth began to tremble or the seas rose, Bakunawa was believed to be behind it. Many swords of the region had Bakunawa's likeness carved into their hilts, in order to bestow the presence and power of the dragon onto the warriors when they engaged in combat. Dragons throughout Asian folklore are both greatly respected and feared, and Bakunawa is no exception to that rule. Our tale begins outside the city of Selene, a Roman province in what is now Libya. Lurking in a large pond was an immense dragon. The dragon dominated its environment as it sat at the top of its food chain, and it was not long before it set its sight on Selene, devouring its people and livestock as they came to the pond for water. In order to satiate the dragon's voracious appetite, and assuage it from attacking the townsfolk, it was decreed that every day a sheep be given to the dragon. For a time the ploy worked, but then the dragon's appetite grew, and soon the ordinance called for 2 sheep per day, and then 3. Soon the city of Selene had run out of sheep, but the dragon still had to be fed, lest he turn upon the populace, and the people die of thirst or dragon's wrath. A new solution was brought up, but one that broke the hearts of its citizens. The children and young people of the town would be chosen by lottery to feed the dragon. Whoever the lot fell upon, wealthy or poor, was delivered to the dragon. It was a heavy toll indeed, and each day there were cries of pain over the loss of their children. But what could they do? No one dared question the ordinance of Selene's king, and the city lacked the strength and courage to face the dragon in combat. The dragon may not have attacked the city itself, but it was slowly killing it, piece by piece, child by child. The townsfolk were trapped. They needed a hero. One fateful day, the lot fell upon the daughter of the king. Desperate to save his daughter's life from the beast that waited outside the city gates, the king begged his citizens to draw again, offering them all his wealth just so his daughter would be spared. But his subjects could not be swayed or bought, for they all had given up something more precious to them than gold or silver. The king had no choice but to oblige. The princess was dressed as a bride and taken to be delivered to the waiting dragon. As the princess waited for the monster bound to the spot, It just so happened that at that very moment, a knight rode into the clearing. He was adorned in strong armor, a lance in one hand, a white shield in the other, bearing a red cross. This was St. George of Cappadocia, a warrior of some renown and a devout Christian. When he saw the weeping maiden, he ventured forth to learn of her predicament. After explaining to the saint her situation, she urged him to flee the area, save his own life, and leave her to her fate. But no sooner did the words escape her lips that the ravenous dragon appeared before them, ready to consume the two of them. The princess shrieked in fear, but St. George made the sign of the cross and valiantly charged. Their battle raged on, and the sounds of their skirmish rang out across the glade. George battling braver than ever before, and the dragon, for once, battling a worthy opponent. In a last-ditch effort, George thrust his lance clean into the dragon's flank, wounding it deeply. As the dragon was trying to gather itself, St. George freed the princess and had her wrap her girdle about the dragon's neck. Using the girdle as a leash, St. George led the defeated dragon into the city. The townsfolk all at once were astonished and afraid, yet joyful that their princess was unharmed. After reuniting the princess with her father, St. George stood before the stunned crowd and the dying dragon, and offered to put an end to the creature's life and their long suffering, on the condition that they convert to Christianity. It was certainly a small price to pay after all the suffering they had endured. Upon agreement, St. George beheaded the dragon, ending its cruel life. After the dragon's corpse was carted out of the city with 4 ox carts, St. George proceeded to baptize the king, the princess, and countless citizens, old and young alike. The king granted the brave knight a reward of gold and silver, but George instead urged him to divide it amongst the people. After St. George went along on his way, the king had built a church honoring the Blessed Virgin Mary and the incomparable St. George. And in the place where George struck the dragon and its blood sank into the ground, an immense spring emerged from the soil, whose water was said to be so pure that it could heal any injury and cure any illness. So ends the tale of St. George and the dragon.